church in Portland, Oregon had a new thing that I think they do every year around Thanksgiving, and had a local temple, Jewish temple, and a local mosque and a sort of community and our church come together for a celebration of thanks. And the three leaders of the three groups each spoke during the evening. And the Jewish guy was just very, very funny, very, very good speaker. But he started out by saying that his father told him, you know, you're perfectly adequate, you're fine, but you're not the most brilliant man in the world. So if you're ever asked to speak, go in the middle. Because the first speaker, you know, sets the impression and gets everybody going and everyone will remember him. And the last speaker is what everybody remembers as they leave. But the middle speaker, whether they do a good job or a bad job, is just going to be forgotten. So you want to be brilliant, you need the middle speaker. So I'm coming before Gwen and John. And after all these other really inspiring speakers, I don't know how you feel at this point in the day, but I just felt so moved by everything that people have shared today, and the way that it's very clear that as people, our dedication and our involvement and our passion for what we're doing makes a huge difference. But things that are being shared here are far beyond what any human can do. And so the hand of God and the power of God and the plan of God seems to me to shine out of everything that's been shared here. I was asked to talk about the outreach to the Lenja people, and that's something that I got introduced to by the Jimma Presbytery. You've already heard of the Jimma Presbytery from our friends from Bilbao Bethel Synod, because Jimma was a presbytery at the point where I got connected with them, and they now have become Synod. They were one of the fastest growing presbyteries at the time and are still very strong and very committed and growing very quickly. So, so holistic, probably most of you know this, the term holistic means having a concern for the whole person, and both ECMY and as I was working at the time for Presbyterian Fellowship, the Presbyterian Church as a whole have a real strong commitment to the whole person, the flesh of the person as well as the soul of the person. The person needs spiritual feeding, they also need physical feeding, they also need emotional feeding, and so holistic has to do with all of that. So, let's try next slide. Technology.
Time for another break here.
I told you it's good. I was going in the middle, right? Just do this. Okay. So my youngest son is, I call him a computer whisperer. He's just so good. And so he's my technology helper. And I'll talk to him, and then I'll go to Best Buy or Fry's or something like that. I'll say, my geeky son tells me I need to get such and such and such. And the guy will listen to me and says, yeah, your geeky son is right. You'll find it on aisle 3. So, then I go get it. It's giving me this menu of options. Next. people in Ethiopia have been deeply despised. They have been considered unclean in a way that we think of in India. If the shadow of a mancha person falls on a non-mancha person, that transmits some uncleanness. The mancha people are given names that have to do with just horrible, nasty things. They have not been allowed to eat with or associate with the dominant people. So in the Kappa area where this project is going on, the Kappa people are the dominant people, and the Mancha are like a subgroup within the Kappa people. And I've heard both that they are not Kappa, and I've heard that they are Kappa, that they are just a subgroup of the Kappa people. So there are some mysteries about that. But the General Presbytery asked me if I would work with them on Mancha outreach. Okay, so General Presbytery is in southwest Ethiopia. Most of you probably know that. The presbytery covers quite a large, I should start calling it General Synod at this point. It covers quite a large area, and it covers a lot of different people groups. It covers people groups that everybody knew about, like the Kappa, and then it covers people groups that people knew about, like Mancha, but weren't really considering part of their calling. And then it also covers people group that keep being discovered. There are people in those forests that were not on anybody's list for a long, long time. It's a mountainous area, it's a rough area, it's an area where a lot of the places are hard to get to. Jimma is considered the home of coffee. They're very proud of that. I haven't been able to find this roundabout in Jimma recently. I think it's been torn down and modernized, but they used to have the Ethiopian traditional Jagana as one of the roundabouts in the town of Jimma with a sign saying, "Welcome to the home of coffee." So at the time that I got introduced, Rasa was the president of Jimma Presbytery. And his story was a really wonderful story to get to hear as we travel on what were at that time very rough, non-year-round roads out into the Jimma Presbyterian areas. He was a nurse, he was trained as a nurse, and he was assigned to work in Jimma. And at that time, Yesus had no churches in Jimma, so he began just meeting for prayer with 3 or 4 other Yesus Christians. And out of that, and that was in 1989, out of that prayer group grew this incredibly robust, at the time, presbytery. Ato Asay took me down to the town of Amelia, and the story of the church in Amelia was also a really fascinating story, which I see some nods, and I know some people have heard that story. It was a story that when Ato Asay began to tell it to me in the vehicle as we bounced along, I stopped him at one point and I said, this is the story of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. And he chuckled, and as we got to Amelia and he was introducing me to people, at one point he introduced me to this man by name, and then he just said softly to me, St. Paul. So I knew that that was the gentleman in the story. What happened in the town of Amelia is somewhat similar. The word of God came to some people there, and they began to pray and worship together. It's a stronghold. Kappa is a stronghold for the Kalicha, the traditional spirit worship and who have that kind of spiritual power and then are what we loosely call witch doctors or shamans in other areas. What I've heard since is that, for example, in the Maji area where I grew up, there are kalijas, and when they are touched by the spirit, they go to Kappa to actually buy their power. So in Mizan and Maji and some of those other areas, Kappa is where they go to actually get that power. And when I heard that story, I thought of the story in Acts where I think it's Simon is a sorcerer, and he sees Peter and the disciples healing people, and he comes to them and says, I want to buy the Spirit of Jesus so that I can do these miracles. So it's the same kind of spiritual practice and interchange that seems to be going on in that area. So Kappa is a very stronghold area. And Omega was an area where according to essayist who told me the story, the Kalijas just had incredible power over the people. There were many, many, many of them. And there were many, many, many taboos. A common person couldn't drink milk from their own cow. It was taboo. Only the Kalija could drink milk, or even eat meat. If a young man died, a commoner, his wife and children and homestead all were not inherited. His wealth was not inherited by his wife and children. His wife and children were inherited by the Kalija and became the Kalija's slaves or servants or concubines, wives, children. The oppression was really deep. You could not plant a tree on your own land because you might get the idea then that land belonged to you because the tree belonged to you and it's in the land. But no, the land belongs to the Kalija. So as we're approaching Amaya, and he's telling me the story of the spread of the gospel, he pointed to the hills and he said, you see those trees on the hillside? This is EEC on my land reform. He said, these are Christians who now are planting trees on their own land because now they know they can do that. So a very rough road out to Amaya. The town church has become a mother church now through this story of the two sons of the Kalija in the Amaya area. One of the sons was touched by the testimony of some of these people from the ECMY in the town praying and worshiping God. So this younger son becomes a Christian. His older son is going to inherit his father's position, is absolutely outraged. And in case you think these are like, people deep in, uneducated people out in the wilds, this older son, who's so defensive of his father's position as the Kalija, is the director of the high school in Amaya town. So these things exist, within and beside each other that we as Americans think if you have education, you're not going to buy that kind of stuff, but that's not the way it works. So the older son's name was Gurma, and he was absolutely adamant he was not going to have this in his family. On his watch, this was not going to happen. So there began to be some feeling about this new Christian group in town. The group grew gradually, and nothing really erupted until someone in the group died, an older man died. And they wanted to have land to bury him. So the small group asked for some land from the local Kabbalah leaders. Well, the Kabbalah leaders went to give us some land, and Burma heard this and wasn't going to have it. And so he organized demonstrations. Now, this is not San Francisco, this is Amaya. But people are marching in the streets saying, no, these people cannot have this land, we're not going to have this. Until the time had passed that this older man needed to be buried. And so he was buried in the back of the police compound, which is just a travesty. In Ethiopia, that is just really grim. So this little group of Christians became the target for some serious persecution, beginning with the burial of this man. They got excluded from the grain mill, the Wacho. They couldn't go there to get their grain mill. They were experiencing this persecution. And there's this silent struggle between the older brother and his younger brother. And then the father fell ill. So the father is the Khadija, the powerful Khadijas of this area. And Brahma, praying for his father, went out to the sacred grove and prayed to the spirits that his father had served and said, you know, my father has served you faithfully, and I am going to serve you faithfully. Heal my father. And as he stood up and walked away, he said to himself, if my father is not healed, I will know that my brother is right, that the God he worships is the God who's most powerful. And that, of course, is what happened, is that his father died. So Ruma came to the group and told them that he had accepted Jesus. Basically, he had said to himself, if my father dies, I will know that that spirit is not a powerful spirit, and I will need to put my life under the protection of Jesus. This is pretty much how he had it figured out. So he came to the group and he said to them, I've become a follower of Jesus, and everybody's happy and rejoicing and welcoming him. And he said, but I have to confess to you that I was the one that was organizing the demonstrations against you. And I have hired people to go and follow your evangelists as they're going out on the path and to kill them. They come back to me and they say, I'm sorry, I tried. I just couldn't do it. Nobody could ever explain why they couldn't do it, but they just came to the moment where they were supposed to do whatever they were going to do, and they just couldn't do it. But he said, I've hired people to assassinate your evangelists. I've been the one organizing these, and so I have to beg your forgiveness. So they begged him and took him into the worshiping group. Later, someone from Lucanius came out to Omega and talked to the group and said, yes, we understand that there was some persecution going on. And he was like, yes, I was the one. But he was now the director of the school. He was asking, please, can I leave my job as director of the school and become a full-time evangelist? Please, I want to serve the church. And the church leaders were saying to him, no, you need to stay director of the school because your salary and your tithing is what helps us build a church. And so as part of his calling then in that church group, he was continuing to be the director of the school, but his heart was just so turned around and so changed that he longed to be a full-time evangelist. When I was introduced to him, at one point I said, I heard your story from Atuase, but would you mind telling me your story? And he laughed and he said, oh yes, I would love to tell you my story. He told me his story, and pieces of it, as he told it to me, I understood his story better. Okay, so that's the story of Omega, and out of Omega came an effort out of Bonga. Now Bonga, when you drive, I don't think now it exists there either, but Bonga has this, we have dueling javanas, one in Jerma and one in Bonga, each claiming to be the home of coffee. And of course you know that Copper Province was probably the source of the name Hopin and the tradition about the goats who were eating the little red berries and got all crispy and excited and couldn't sleep, and the discovery of coffee. So the Mancha people are an untouchable people that live in the forests. They don't seem to have their own language. They seem to be possibly indigenous people in those areas. What's happening Plus, the Mancha haven't traditionally had any rights to the land. They just were there in the forest. So when the forest gets cut down and that land becomes available for agriculture, the Mancha who are living there have no rights to it. They are not agriculturalists. That has been adjusted some by the government. They are allowed to have these little homesteads. But it's not really a livelihood, and they are not agriculturalists. So their situation is pretty dire and pretty serious. They do have the homestead. You can see that they're growing the gote with the big leaves and sugar cane and some of the local things, but the livelihood for the Mancha people has been a real question. So the town of Chiri, outside of Bonga, the man who's on our right as we look at this is a pastor. As Ethiopia works, people are assigned to different towns to go and work for the government. So a man was, a Makaniasus member was assigned to the town of Chiri to go work as a government worker. Well, he was a member of Makaniasus, so he came from Jimma, so he came to Ose and said, I'm being assigned to this town of Chiri. I want you to send an evangelist with me so that I can plant a church. And Ose said, well, of course, let's do that. This man, being from Jimma, was a former Muslim. So he's going down to the town of Chiri into Kaffa province. He's an outsider. And he wants to plant a church. And he's got his evangelist with him, who is the gentleman on the right-hand side, whose name, wonderful, wonderful pastor. They go to the town of Chiri. Well, in the town of Chiri, the guy from Jumma doesn't know who's who, he doesn't know who's Mancha, he doesn't know who's Papa, he doesn't care anything about it, he doesn't care about the Mancha. He's talking to whoever he can about the gospel. And it's the Mancha people who are responding. Well, this guy is from the area, and he knows that the Mancha people are unclean. And so he goes to say, and he says, I've got this problem. We're trying to plant a church in the town of Chiri, but my comrade here is speaking to the Mancha people, and they're the ones who are responding. But if I start a church among the Mancha, then the Kaffa, the dominant people, will never come, and this is not going to work. So I've about decided that what I need to do is to start my church and to minister to the Kaffa people, and the Mancha people can sit outside and listen to the gospel and sing outside, like they do at the Orthodox Church. The church has been there for 200 to, whatever it is, 400 years. So that's what I'm planning to do. So when I tell the story in U.S. congregations, I say, well, he came to his Presbyterian advisor, his Presbyterian exec, for advice, and as any good Presbyterian exec would say, if you do that, your ministry will be cursed. So this is what Ase said to him, your ministry will not thrive. You cannot do that. So with his heart in his throat, my pastor friend went back to the town of Chiri and began to work among the Mancha to start a church. And as we keep hearing in Ethiopia, many interesting things happened. A woman who had been possessed by a demon and had been, ranting and raving up and down the streets of the town, no one really claiming her or taking care of her or really being able to control her in any way. The Christians came and prayed for her. She spoke, gave her testimony while we were there. At one point she was learning to read. She had come to Christ and had been delivered, and it was just this shining, wonderful spirit in the church. These kinds of things happened, and a church developed among the people in the town of Chiri. Well, at a certain point, the Kaffa people started hanging around the church, and people would say to them, why are you hanging around with those bunch of people? And they said, well, we're end, as they asked if some people would like to share their testimonies, and one of the people who stood up was a luncheon man. He said, no, they call me a dog. I went into town, I had to take one of those goodberry leaves with me, and I had to fold it into a cup if I went to the tea shop or to drink beer, local beer. If I touched the cup, a real cup, no one would ever use it again. So I had to fold my leaf, and they would pour my drink into the cup, and they would take my money, they would hold their hand, and I would have to drop the money from the long ways away so that we never touched each other. Nothing that I touched except my money could be touched by the other people. And then he reached down and lifted up the glass that he had drunk his orange soda from and said, you see, here today I have been a person with you in Christ. I am a person, and I have drunk from the glass with you. So at this point, the Chile Town Church was the center for luncheon worship, and the luncheon were being accepted into the church. They were being baptized, and they began to have preaching points out from there because people were walking 3 hours on Sunday morning to come into the Chile church from the forest where they lived. So as I began to take people down there from the U.S. churches, we would go into a home, there they would have singing, they would have a little bit of a worship service with us, have a time of prayer. Of course, the partners had to bring greetings, and so we had to go from English to Amharic to Kapenya because there wasn't anybody who understood all three and could get there any more efficiently. And there would always, of course, in being Ethiopia, there would always be hospitality. These are people whose livelihood has disappeared. These are people who are at the absolute bottom of the economic scale in Ethiopia. But they would bring a little bit of roasted corn or a little bit of kocho, and we had coffee with salt and butter in those homes. I always had to warn my American colleagues that the missionary prayer is, where you lead me, I will follow. What they feed me, I will swallow. So I would warn them ahead of time, but I would also tell them that they could pass anything down to me, and I would appreciate it. So one of the things that I was asked to organize was a sheep bank, where a sheep would be given, kind of like African Project does, a sheep would be given to a family, the offspring of the sheep would belong to the family, and then that breeder sheep would be passed on to another family. The Luncheon people were very, very excited about this. The people in the U.S. were very excited about this. I went with my pastor of my church and several others down to see the sheep after this was started. And we were traveling through Ethiopia and gone down to this area, and my pastor finally said to me, when are we going to see some sheep? What? What have you been looking at all along the sides of the road? Oh, well, those were goats, weren't they? Well, she was looking for fluffy, Mary had a little lamb type sheep. So it dawned on me that what I knew to be sheep, she was not recognizing as sheep at all. So I finally hit upon a formula to tell people if its ears are pointed up and its tail is pointed up, it's a goat. And if its ears are down and its tail is down, it's a sheep. And that's how you tell them apart. These are hair sheep. These are tropical sheep. If they had all that woolly stuff, they would expire. So Ethiopian sheep look different. Unfortunately, what happened is that it was discovered that because these were forest lands that are now being cut down, there's some kind of virus or fungus or disease in the soil that affected the sheep. So as the church leaders began to see this happen, the sheep had to be transferred to another people group in another area, and the Luncheon people were very sad because, of course, this was a source of protein and a source of income, would have a source of income for them, but there just wasn't anything we could do. So the next thing that they approached me was to help them to do beekeeping. Because they're forest people, traditional beekeeping was something that they did. So could we get a beekeeping project going where they would do more modern beekeeping? What was fascinating to me about that was that the difference between traditional beekeeping and modern beekeeping is a matter of domestication, domesticating the bees. So in a hunter-gatherer paradigm, the bees are kind of like a wild animal, and they're producing something, and you go hunting, and you kill them, and you collect the honey, and you go home. Well, in a modern beekeeping, you've domesticated bees. You care for the bees. You keep them safe, and then they keep producing for you, just like a cow does, or some other domestic animal. To me, this was a fascinating idea. So there was a wonderful training program that they instituted. Kapa gets a lot of rain. In fact, they tried a PR program in Kapa that made me chuckle, but they took it very seriously and thought it was brilliant. That they had posters that said 13 months of rain. I tried to explain why that might not attract tourists, but they said, but it makes it green. It makes our land green. So it really does. There's lots of flowers year-round in the Kapa area, and so it was an ideal one for beekeeping. This was an experimental beekeeping station. There was a university beekeeper in the area, and we did training. There were healthy bees. At this point, there's been some hive collapse in the area. The bunch of people did not take hold of this project the way that we hoped they did, but the side product of it was that some of the evangelists sat in on the training, and it became, they saw the opportunity for a cottage industry to support their evangelism, because often the evangelists, since they are no longer working the land and being subsistence farmers, they're counseling people, pastoral counseling, talking to people about Jesus. They're out and about, not doing their farming. They need some source of income for buying food. So this has become a cottage industry for local evangelists. Now, because of the hive collapse problems in some areas, what they've done is to move all the hives to one area. They have assigned one of the evangelists to take care of all the hives, and then each of the evangelists who's part of this kind of honey co-op then gets their cut of honey. So they've been very creative in figuring out how to make this work. But they ran into some difficulties that were completely unexpected, which is they were bringing in hives from Kenya, and the bees in Kenya are smaller than the bees in Ethiopia, so the patterned wax that gives the pattern for the beehive, the bees of Ethiopia were too crowded and were not willing to make hives off of that Kenyan wax. So this is part of what you run into in mission work, is you just never know what the obstacles are going to be or where things are going to go in a direction other than what you thought. One of the big issues for the Manchu people was beginning to train lay leadership and eventually hopefully pastoral leadership. And the biggest problem on that was, although Juneau Presbytery was fantastic at bringing people in and running these leadership programs, the Manchu couldn't stay overnight. They had to go home because they couldn't sleep in the hotels or they couldn't eat in the restaurants. And so Juneau Presbytery came to me to ask, could you please help us get a training center set up in Boca with some little dormitories and a little dining room and a kitchen, so that these people can come for more than a one-day training. I'm going to show you picture from the Daily Church. The last time I visited there, there was a youth group skit on a Sunday morning. And you'll see that these kids are very different looking from each other. And I was told that this youth group, especially the youth group, the Kappa and the Mancha kids, are working together. And they said to me, yes, we even invite each other to our weddings now. There's no intermarrying, but there is common celebration. And I just want to footnote this and come back to it. But the Amelia Bible School, the last time I visited there, had two firsts, the first woman student and the first Mancha student. So this guy, in some way, had gotten enough education to qualify, and they said he was doing very, very well, that he was speaking right up in class and being very assertive, given his background, and they had high hopes for him as the first Mancha pastor. The issue that I brought up with them at the time was if you have a mixed church with Kappa and Mancha congregants, they were very, very, very dedicated to having that, not to have separate Kappa churches and separate Mancha churches. And on the surface, that seems like the right thing for unity in Christ. However, human beings being what they are, I started asking them, how are the Mancha people going to come into leadership? It just was found to be problematic that the Kappa people would have more education, they would see themselves as the ones qualifying for the positions of leadership. It would be very, very difficult to see the Mancha people actually being empowered into leadership in a joint church. So I just asked them questions. I asked them to think about this. Jima is now a synod, and Say has finished his term. His term limits have come up. He trained leaders to come after him. The synod is functioning well. On the right is case up there. And on the left is, on the right is Ato and on the left is case Kappada. It's also case Hyder? No? Okay. The last few times I came through Jima, they said, you better not stay. You better go quickly. So I flew into Jima, got picked up by the car, and went directly out because of the MS. So it's been a while since I've seen it. So they both case. The Bonga Training Center is finished enough that they are starting to use it. They're working on getting windows and doors in. But in the meantime, what started out as DAC, Daro Amelia Kappa project, which had a lot of training and subsidy for the Amelia Bible School and outreach, became TS DAC. Because in the meantime, another people group was discovered way up in the forest, the Tsara people, TSARA. And interestingly, when they began to do outreach with them, it was in the Omega Training Center. They were talking about the people groups, and they were talking about, we've got these people up here in the forest, the Tsara people, and one of the young trainees said, may I be evangelist to the Tsara people? When I was a little boy, my caretaker, my nanny, was Tsara, and I speak some of that language. So we went up into the forest. I went up there with Bill Young on one of my trips up to the Tsara people and worshipped with them, prayed with them in just a little grass shelter. And we had a big discussion at the time about what language group. Nobody even knew what language family the Tsara language was. Nobody knew any two languages to where we could start zeroing in on, is it related to Walaita, is it related to Kappa, is it related, what language is it related to? So this was a new outreach into the Tsara group. There's also a Yem group in that area that General Presbytery began to do ministry among, came down out of the hills and had a worship service with them as well. So General Presbytery / Synod has just been one of these places where the spirit of reaching out to the unreached really informed their identity and their growth pattern. Really wonderful way. So I didn't want to have this just be a report of a project, but I had some thoughts and some questions to put it in a bigger context that to me have come out of this work. And one of those questions came up to my mind yesterday out of the discussions, and that is there an EBCMY culture that is going to feel foreign to the Zara people, to even the Amaya people, to the Dauro people, to the Yem, that's going to feel just as foreign as a U.S. church planting effort might feel to, or might have felt to the people, the dominant culture groups of Ethiopia when the missionaries were coming. Is there a danger that EBCMY culture and liturgy and style of worship and style of music is actually not the culture of all of the people of Ethiopia, and that there needs to be some thinking about how to let the gospel take root in those cultures themselves and into their style of music. The style of music thing is going fairly well, but there are pieces of what I see as EBCMY culture, church culture, that may feel foreign to some of these people groups. So I throw that out as a question that I, as an observer, am asking. And the reason it came up to me yesterday was that this conversation about people going back to their traditional worship. Is it possible that as people's cultures, there's an urbanization, there's a modernization, all throughout the world, people's traditional cultures are being broken down by all of these things. And we all hate to lose our cultures. And is it possible that also in the spread of the gospel can be one of those pieces that's breaking down people's cultures? And in reaction, they're going back to their traditional worship. Is that a possible danger that could face the church in Ethiopia? Ethiopia's context, I know. I think my dad talked about in northern India, that's a problem where dancing was forbidden in some of us in that northern India place where the church just grew and expanded and was like 98% Christian, and now the young people are leaving the church because they can't dance. The really beautiful traditional dances, because the church, the early Christians said, absolutely, dancing. So again, people have such a drive to stay connected to their culture. They get so alienated and troubled by losing their culture that if we're not careful, we could be the cause of people going back to their traditional religions because the culture of Christianity feels foreign. Is there the flexibility within the EBCMY church culture to allow the gospel to really penetrate these cultures deeply so that their practices in worship may look different from the practices of worship in Gori, in Addis Ababa, in Majid, say? Another question that bumps up against this Mancha Kappa issue is that will the church leaders be those who are good at education rather than being real leaders of the community? seminary, the ones who can go on in education? Are they really the leaders of the community, or are they just the ones who are good at learning? And we have the same problem here in the States. What seminary requires of people and what seminary causes people to become isn't always producing pastoral spirit in those who come out of seminary. We have the same problem here in the United States. It's a question I ask of the Church in Ethiopia as well. And again, because of the whole breakdown of culture and the change that's going on, will the churches only appeal to those young people whose culture is already being broken down? I met somebody in Ethiopia on one of my trips who said, oh, I think it's the Bole Yesus is, I think it was a member of the Bole Yesus congregation. He said, you really should come and worship with us. There are many old people in our congregation. And I just, of course, I laughed because here in the United States we would be like, oh, you must come, there's many young people in the congregation. But that imbalance is here, the young people are with us, and there, the older people are not in the churches. And so again, what does that have to do with culture, and how can the gospel reach to all of the community? Fortunately, this is all Missio Dei. This is God's mission, not ours. So even though we face these concerns, we face these imbalances, we face these struggles, thankfully, this is God's church and God's mission, and we can do our best, knowing we're fallible and knowing that God has the final answers. So as the gospel goes forward, I think the question sometimes gets to be with traditional religion or with Muslims, like which God do we worship? Is it your God or is it my God? And we get these God wars going on. Well, as my dad said to me one time, there's only, if you're talking about God who created the earth, there can only be one, logically. There weren't several of them that we have to argue about. So the God who created the earth is God. The question is, what do we know about the character of God? Is there a full picture of the character of God? Is the love of God portrayed in what you've been taught about God? Is the mercy of God being portrayed in what you've been taught about God? Is there some piece of what we've seen of God in Jesus that we could add to what you understand about God, or correct in what you understand about God, instead of trying to say you have to slash this God, not sign. If we can focus on the character of God. And what I'm struck by of what we've talked about earlier today, the stories of God's work, people from the Bible, reveal the character of God. That speaks for the theology. The theology came out of the Bible. We don't have to theologize. We can share the stories. And we as human beings have been created to love story. And story can speak to people. So much of what's being talked about here today is speaking Bible so that people hear the Bible stories, the Jesus films, so that people see and hear Bible stories instead of theology. I think those kinds of movements are really going to do nothing but strengthen these kind of outreach efforts. So that is the story that I know of the outreach of the General Presbyterian, now Synod, to the Hunter people, and some of the things that I learned from walking alongside over a number of years. So I just want to end with one final story about the effort to assist the Hunter people with the struggle that they have of livelihood replacement. The sheep bank failed. The beekeeping kind of failed. And at a certain point in my walk with them, I felt quite let down and discouraged about this. But the last time I was there, one of the pastoral leaders said, by the way, you know, the bunch of people used to build their houses so low that you couldn't stand up in them. But over this period of time that we've been working with them and that you've been coming, and you've been coming back, and you've been bringing Americans with you, the bunch of people have started building houses you can stand up in. There's been a transformation in their feeling about themselves that has happened as a result of our outreach to them, our evangelism of them, your efforts to come and walk beside them. They are now building houses you can stand up in. I was just so touched by that because, again, this is Missio Dei. This is God is going to work through us. I thought we were trying to bring sheep. I thought we were trying to bring beekeeping. And instead, what happened was a kind of empowerment and dignity that came to them as a result of these very valid efforts. So it ended up being a story, like kind of an Easter resurrection story for me of success and failure and how God uses our very limited efforts for His purpose. I'll answer questions if anybody has them, or we can have a look at Thank you.
And to be back. We are not losing.